Hello, hello everyone. Welcome to module number 4. This is the entry of the clinical theories, and today we're going to explore psychodynamics. Psychodynamics is broken into three distinct theories known as psychoanalysis. You may be familiar with good old Sigmund Freud. The second is Jungian, also known as analytical psychology, founded by Carl Jung and his colleagues. And then finally, individual psychology, also known as Adlerian. So I want to give a caveat first, and I'll talk more about this in a slide. Understand these theories are highly complex and takes years of mastery to understand them. And we're covering them in 3 weeks. So understand that I understand that it may be confusing at times, these modules, these theories. There's a lot of information at you. So I respect that. I'm providing all this information for you to cherry pick on what are you going to utilize to help describe the personality development of the fictional character in this module, as well as possibly using these theories for your autobiography. So again, I'm providing all this information with the intent that you can cherry pick what resonates with you. With that being said, let me share my screen. Okay, I'm going to make this large. So, psychoanalysis, setting the scene as I already said before. So, these theories are weird. They're controversial and highly complex. These are the oldest theories we'll be talking about in this class, stemming from psychoanalysis, was published essentially in 1899 with the theories of Freud's book about dream analysis. But Freud, being a very egotistical person, even though it was published in 1899, wanted the publication date to be 1900 because he felt that was more symbolically appropriate, creating some sort of groundbreaking theory in the new century. So, the thing to remember though, with all the controversy of these theories and the outdatedness of some of these concepts, these theories are still highly popular in society. Many are familiar mostly with probably Freud and some of these other concepts. We're also in a resurgence right now of Jungian theory. Myers-Briggs type indicator is founded or has foundations of Jungian, aka analytical psychology, and that's extremely popular on the internet. In addition to, there are a lot of individuals on the internet using Jungian theory who do not have a strong understanding of these concepts. So there's a lot of misuse of these theories as well. But we're definitely a resurgence of the psychodynamics right now because they help us understand that humans are not rational and humans are highly motivated by feelings. And the last 2 years, I think, kind of give good examples socially of feelings overcoming logic and rationality. So understand, I'm throwing a lot at you, and at times these theories may feel confusing. Again, these theories take years of mastery. If you ever decide to become a psychoanalyst, that's Freudian, or analytical, excuse me, an analytical psychologist, Jungian, those traditions typically required 6 years after your traditional college to become an analyst. So these theories can take a lot of years to master and understanding. So it's okay to feel confused. The biggest thing to take away is essentially these key points. And there's going to be another slide that reiterates this. But much of our personality is influenced by internal forces that are outside of our awareness. And many times these forces come from our past, can be our past that we have experienced or genetically from our past. And that will be brought up in analytical psychology. Personality can grow and change, and that's going to occur by increasing our awareness, making the unconscious conscious. In addition to, these theories are striving for balance. We have many different parts that we're going to talk about in this series as well as the other two, and balancing those parts is what's going to promote a healthy lifestyle. Okay, so there's two terms I want to break down to. You're going to hear psychoanalysis and psychodynamics. These words have different meanings. Psychoanalysis, that's specific to Sigmund Freud and his followers' development of a psychotherapeutic and philosophical system of human behavior. So psychotherapeutic, it means we can use this in a clinical setting to promote growth and change, and philosophical system where many of these ideas are used to critique society. Critical theory has a strong basis, or certain elements of critical theory has a strong basis of psychoanalysis, as well as we're seeing a lot of this in art and cultural analysis. So for those who know art history, surrealist movement, excuse me, was highly influenced by psychoanalytic writings. Um, and as we'll see this in a lot of films, part of the assignment is to look at fictional depictions. Many character development in our media is based off psychoanalytic principles. So that's psychoanalysis. Psychodynamics, that's an umbrella term for psychotherapeutic and philosophical systems that view much of human behavior stemming from unconscious processes and conflict stemming from chaotic interaction between internal and external forces. So psychoanalysis is part of the psychodynamics. Psychodynamics is an umbrella term, right? So when we use psychoanalysis, that's specifically Freud and those branches that branched off Freud. Psychodynamics is a massive umbrella that not only includes Adlerian and Jungian, but other theories that we're not going to be talking about today, such as object relationship, Lacanian, based off Jacques Lacan, self-psychology, based off Kohut. But again, to really reiterate, psychodynamics is more of a broad term. So psychoanalysis, that literally translates to the study / exploration of the mind / soul, aka the psyche. And we'll talk about what we mean by the psyche in the next slide. Psychodynamics translates to the movement of the mind / soul psyche. So psycho being derivative of psyche, dynamics meaning movement. What happens is our personality is going to grow in development when there's consistent growth and movement within our internal mind, our psyche. Issues occur when there's stagnation. So whether our personality hasn't grown to adapt the environment, that's going to cause some sort of stagnation, possibly a mental health concern, or definitely interpersonal issues. We see this a lot in couples relationships or relationships in general. When one person grows and develops and the other person stays stagnant, that can cause rupture in the relationships. Again, can happen with friends, can happen with lovers, can happen with colleagues. And so really the emphasis on the psychodynamics is our personality is constantly growing and changing. And when it stops growing and changing, stagnating, or aka stagnation, that's when possible problems occur. All right, key themes. Big theme right here. Personality is greatly influenced from past events. So this is the opposite of the trait theorist, where we're looking in the present moment. So who you are as a person is greatly influenced by what happened to you in the past. All behavior is going to have some sort of purpose or meaning. Okay. So as the Adlerians say, all purpose is behavior. All, I really messed that up. As the Adlerians say, all behavior is purposeful. So anything you do is a reflection of your personality. The media you consume, the friends you have, even the food you eat has some sort of meaning to it. Now, we don't want to overanalyze everything. And the thing to remember is when we're using these theories, we want to take a holistic, more broad view of understanding all these data points. But understand that the major you picked in college, the profession you're interested in, the movies you consume, the dreams you have, and the fantasies you have in waking life all somehow connect to your personality. So that's the key theme. And you can agree with that, disagree with it, that's totally fine. Let's understand from this lens, that's an important point. The other thing to really remember is that behavior, even negative, can have positive benefits. And we call that secondary gains. So again, these models go against this idea that humans are rational and logical and do things for their best interest. This perspective is even when someone's engaging in negative behavior, let's say behavior that is harmful, could be substance abuse, could be making poor life decisions, could be having relationships fall apart, there's some sort of secondary benefit to this. And it's important to understand what that may be. Um, Even being, what do you call it, purposefully trying to make your life chaos can give the benefit of control. I can control to make things fall apart, and that gives me a sense of control. So, whenever we're looking at behavior, especially, um, can be helpful when understanding how children behave. If someone's acting out, if a child's acting out, there could be some benefit to this. So, what we see sometimes happening in school settings with young children, that acting out, even though there can be punishment and repercussions for that, that acting out can give a secondary gain of allowing that child to get attention. And so maybe they're not feeling seen or heard, and so they have to accelerate their behavior in order to get that attention, and that's a secondary gain. So, next point. Again, reiterate this a few times, but from these theories, humans are highly irrational. They are motivated symbolically, so symbols and feelings have a huge impact on them. If that seems kind of foreign to you, that premise is highly used in marketing. Symbols and feelings are greatly utilized in commercials with the idea that's going to impact your behavior. So, a lot of this is most of the times we're unaware of the motives of behavior. And so, the thing to remember is a lot of times we act, we're not really sure why, we haven't put thought to it. And again, we don't always utilize rational logic because we're more motivated by feelings and symbols. So, our mind, aka our psyche, and again, I'm going to explain that in the next slide, it tries to protect us from our insecurities and anxieties through the use of psychological factors, also known as defense mechanisms and coping styles. So many of you who are already kind of reflected upon this in some of the assignments that internally, especially for when utilizing the informant or asking someone you care about to explain your behavior in 5 or more words, that you have experienced the anxiety and insecurity in yourself of trying to describe yourself. Some of you had a harder time, some had a more easier time, but already there's been an awareness that internally we have critical voices that can fuel our anxieties and our insecurities. And so then we'll use defense mechanisms or coping styles to overcome those anxieties in some capacity. They're there, but some people develop a strong ability to suppress those insecurities in quite a capacity. And then we're going to see that in the Adlerian slides about the development of inferiority and superiority complexes. So, again, from these models, personality can change at any time, but there has to be some awareness, some focus on understanding why we act a certain way through exploring unexpressed emotions, thoughts, and fantasies. So, again, it's very symbolic, very feeling based. And if we understand these things that are uncomfortable, that can allow the growth and change of our personality. So, I've used this term a few times. What do we mean by psyche? Well, unfortunately, we don't really know. It's all going to depend on what theory we're utilizing. So, it can be described as our soul, because that's where the word, the Greek root comes from, representing soul. It can mean the totality of our mind. That's more kind of the Freudian view. It can be what consciousness, being sentient, is, or a core element that distinguishes from other animals. It can also have religious context as well, and that's going to be more the Jungian perspective. And also an Adlerian view, which we'll cover as well in this module. Adlerians typically don't use the word psyche. Essentially, how they view the psyche, it's anything outside of your awareness. So if you're not aware of it, it's part of the psyche. The thing to remember, whatever it truly is, we may not be able to describe it, but the psyche is seen as containing elements of ourselves that are hidden or not fully expressed. So it's things in our psychological mind that we can't access. And we may have experienced that before. There may be a time we're sitting somewhere and we have a memory that comes up, and we're like, where the heck did that come from? And that memory may have been the result of some sort of stimuli in our environment. But essentially, that memory is somehow deep within our mind and was able to be expressed. So, again, from this framework, and it's totally fine if you don't agree with this framework, but if we stick with this framework, essentially, by exploring one's psyche, we're going to learn more about ourselves, gain more control over our behaviors, and can grow as a person. So, I'm sure many of you have heard of the iceberg model of psychoanalytic, Freud's theory of our psyche. So, Freud broke the model of our psyche into three major parts. There's more complexity to it, but for simplicity, we're just going to focus on the three major parts. And he had the ego, which again, we can see above the water. That's what we're consciously aware of. And then we're going to have the superego, which we'll talk about in a future slide. And then the id is things that are deeply down under the water, repressed. So anything above the water, we're conscious of. Anything below the water, we are unconscious of. So how our psyche is broken up to from a Freudian model is three parts. The first part we're going to start with is the id. So we have the I. So think of I in the word id related to instincts. It's things we're born of. It's things we're born with. So the id is going to be present in early infants, and they're still building the concept of themselves, others in reality. But inherently, we have instincts we're born with, and the id is going to be present. So the id is part of the personality that is focused on instant gratification and primal survival. The id is me focused. So feed me, take care of me, hold me. That's coming from the id. So with that, all infants are essentially from this model know that they exist, and hence why they're focused on the me. They don't really care about the others. It's very me focused. So as we age, the id is going to become repressed for most of us. There's some where it doesn't, but again, if you're very me focused, it's going to be hard to function in society. And so we're going to lose awareness and control of these forces. So the id's going to get repressed into our unconscious, but it's still going to be present in some capacity. So the thing to remember with psychoanalysis, nothing goes away. It just may be stored in another mental container, but it's going to find a way to get expressed in somehow. So all these things are energy based. There's movement and momentum to them. They want to move. So if we keep them contained in a box, they're going to find a way to seek expression and seep out of the box. And that's the whole premise of Freudian slips, the slips of the tongue. So the old joke from the Freudian kind of joke book goes, a Freudian slip is when you say one thing, but you mean your mother, right? So it's supposed to be saying you mean another, but the mother is a slip of the tongue, right? That's a very bad example, but hopefully you have an understanding what we mean by slips of the tongues. And again, the id's going to be present in dreams and fantasies. From the Freudian view, when you analyze dreams, it's all about wish fulfillment. And a lot of times that wish fulfillment is instant gratification and primal survival. In times of stress, the id may come up. So in times of stress, you may feel, okay, I know it's not right to eat a pint of Ben and Jerry's and a whole bag of Cheetos, but I'm stressed right now and I need to feel some sort of gratification. And then next thing you know, you're going to do that. Logically, you know it wasn't healthy, you know it was bad for you, but you did it anyways. And from this view, this is the id kind of taking over of our personality structure. So the next is the superego. So again, from this development, and it's a developmental model, if an infant's born with the id that's focused on me, feed me, take care of me, eventually they're going to learn that they're going to have to rely on others in order to survive. And that's going to be where the superego starts coming in. So in order to get my needs met, I have to rely on others. And the superego, that's essentially society. We internalize the norms and values of society, and it creates this consciousness, this official conscious of how we should be. So, those critical voices, those negative voices in your head that you should be doing this, you should be doing that, that can come from the superego. So, really, from this model, what happens is the superego typically reaches a point of conflict during toilet training. So, if you think about toilet training, aka potty training, what we have right now in that child is the child has an instinct and biological need to go to the bathroom, whether to urinate, defecate, whatever it may be. So they feel that urge and they have to do that. There's a point, though, in their development when they have to learn how to control that urge and learn that there's only acceptable places for them to do that natural bodily function. So that's where this conflict arises. And what we'll see is the child has to control their body over a societal expectation. Again, there's only certain places and certain times when you can do this, right? So they have to control their body to meet society's expectations. And this is where the superego really comes into play. And and so we can see behaviorally a lot of struggles for this. It can be a very stressful time for a child using these perspectives. So again, the superego, that's going to contain the conscious and unconscious elements. There's going to be the shoulds that we're aware of, but there's also going to be deeper internalized norms and values that we don't notice that greatly influence us. And so part of developing as a person can be exploring in a deeper sense all those internalized messages from society we've experienced. So the conscious element of the superego, you can think of the Jiminy Cricket, kind of that little thing on your shoulder telling you how you should be and should behave. The third component is the ego. So this is the sense of self. This is who we are aware of. And the primary role of the ego is to make sense of everything we experience. So to make sense of ourself, our world, and others. So again, if we go back to the iceberg, the ego is above the water. And the ego has a lot of power. And its role is to mitigate the wants, needs, and conflicts between the superego, society, and the id, the instincts. And those are going to clash, going back to the toilet training component. Those will clash. And so the ego is going to find a way to balance those things. In addition, so the superego and id have more of a perspective that doesn't really take into consent, have a perspective that does not really look at I can't speak. Has a, the ego can focus on what's really happening in the moment, where the id and the superego lose that perspective. So we call the ego using the reality principle. It's trying to keep a grasp on reality. So again, the ego has a lot of roles. It wants us to really understand what's going on in our world, self, and others, and to understand the reality of it, and also needs to mitigate these very, very powerful forces of instincts and societal expectations. So, with that, our ego needs to have some sort of strength, and we call this ego strength. And that's the concept of how well an individual can respond to changes in situations, diversity, stress, anxiety, and traumatic events. And so at times, the ego, even though it's based off reality, is going to have to distort reality in order to mitigate all these circumstances and to keep the id and superego from overwhelming us. So this is the whole going to be the whole concept of balance, right? We don't want too strong of an ego, because I'm sure you know individuals who have a strong ego, because that can lead to egocentric or self-centered narcissism. Okay, so what it means, this is someone who is way confident in who they are and may not be able to understand others in the world. They may be more focused on themselves. Too weak of an ego and other forces are going to begin to take hold, whether it's superego, the id, etc. Uh, this is what could be so overwhelming it leads to psychosis, can lead to groupthink, or some sort of sense of conformity. So, in the case of the id, or excuse me, if there's too weak of an ego and the superego comes up, we're going to see a lot of groupthink and conformity in that capacity. If there is too much of an the ego completely collapse, and then what we're going to see is there's a flooding of unconscious material, and that could lead to the old school term of psychosis, a completely removal of the reality. Um, so the key thing to remember is the ego is playing this very complicated balance game. It wants to keep the superego and id happy, also doesn't want them to overwhelm the individual, and also doesn't want the ego to be too strong. And so, uh, with that, there's going to be use of defense mechanisms, which we'll talk into it. So, if I had to summarize this slide, I will real quickly understand that how our personality is developed and is consisting throughout our lives is a constant internal struggle. And I'm sure you've experienced this yourself. There's times you're going to be, well, a part of me feels this, but another part of me wants that. There'll be times where I know I shouldn't do this, but I'm going to do this anyways. Or there may be times I don't know why I keep doing this, but I keep doing it anyways. There's going to be that internal struggle. So, with that internal struggle, we have two types of behaviors that we can classify: ego dystonic and ego syntonic. Ego dystonic is behaviors that go against the self. So, this is what I mean by that is I'm doing something that I know is not me, something wrong. I don't want to feel this way. So, these are important, especially from a clinical lens, because depending on what type of behaviors are being presented, is more likely someone going to seek out support and want to change. So, an ego dystonic, when someone feels that the behaviors they're engaging goes against who they are, you'll hear them describe it as this is not me, something is wrong, I don't want to feel this way, I want to change. So, most people seeking out personality change is going to occur when they're experiencing behaviors or traits of ego dystonic. So, this is not me, I want to be a different person, and that's going to what we call ego dystonic. Ego syntonic is going to be behaviors that strengthen the self. So people who are engaging in ego syntonic behaviors, they're going to rarely seek out personality change unless they're forced to. So this can be someone who's mandated to counseling, someone who's forced by the legal system to go through some sort of substance abuse treatment or mental health treatment. Could also be, let's say you have a roommate who is just doing behaviors that are annoying the crap out of you, but for them, there's some sort of benefit to it. And that conflict could result in them seeking out change, or it may not be. But typically, egosyntonic behaviors are behaviors that strengthen the sense of self. So, historically, and there's a lot of controversy with personality disorders, but historically, a personality disorder would be defined as egosyntonic. They're engaging in behaviors that actually strengthens who they are. We can see this sometimes in, let's say you have a roommate who has hygiene issues, those hygiene behaviors may be strengthening their sense of self. Maybe there's a spiritual component behind those hygiene's complaints. Maybe there's some sort of psychological benefit from that, but that's strengthening who they are. And that can be difficult. A lot of times, if we have someone in our life that's ego syntonic, that may make us feel ego dystonic. And so, again, it's finding that balance. Okay. So, moving on to the next thing. There's a lot that motivates us from a psychoanalytic view. And why that is Freud. This is going to be a controversial statement. Freud was notorious for stealing other people's ideas. What I mean by that is why his model over time became more expansive was not only the criticism of focusing purely on sexuality to explain how personality is developed, but also he integrated other people's ideas into his model. So as it went along, being influenced by Adler's and Jung's writing, Freud starts to talk about different drives, and specifically life and death drives. So these are important mainly for extreme psychopathology, individuals who engage in behaviors that are very deviant. We can use these models to help understand that. Essentially, what it is, we are motivated to engage in behaviors that are influenced by Eros, the life instinct, and Thanatos, the death instinct. So both drives exist within us and compete for expression. Again, very similar theme that's coming out through these slides. The life instinct is motivated for a sense of consistency and personal legacy. And we'll see this. Many of us fear death, and that's understandable. And we'll talk more about death and the existential theories of personality. But many of us are motivated to give some sort of legacy that's going to outlive us, whether that's a part of why we want children. Maybe that's why we're doing good work in the community. Underneath all of that, that positive work is the strive that we want to be remembered and we want to have some sort of personal legacy. Thanatos, on the other hand, is motivated for change and completion. So I know that's going to sound so bizarre, but one way to look at death is it is final. It ends something. And there's also change. We go from living to dead. So symbolically, death represents change. And that's a big focal point in Jungian theory. There's going to be change after death. And again, it completes a cycle of life. So, what happens though when these senses get out of out of whack, it's going to create behaviors that are kind of stuck, right? This is going to be the stagnation. So if we're having if we're not finding completion in our life or a sense of closure, what happens is this behavior known as repetitive compulsion. Repetitive compulsion is I may be engaged, excuse me, what it is I may be engaging in behaviors that I know are negative, that I know are not good for me, whether it's substance use or other risky behaviors, being in really, really unhealthy relationships. But the reason why I'm doing that is I'm trying to find closure. So, to get very Freudian, I may be in very unhealthy relationships because a partner may remind me of a parent. And if I can change that partner, I can symbolically change what happened to me in the past. So therefore, I may be constantly in these horrible relationships in order to promote some sort of change or closure. We call that repetitive compulsion. And again, we can see this model used with substance use, used with other behaviors that from the outside may not make sense to us, but from this view, it could give us an explanation of why people still engage in these behaviors. So, from this model, this is where psychopathology develops. It comes from either too much expression of one or both of these drives, too little expression from both these drives, or an entanglement of the two drives. So again, to get really dark real quickly and to get into deviance, serial killers, well, that's to jump deep into the pool. To understand extreme deviant behavior, such as mass murderers and serial killers, we see this strong, messed up integration of sexuality with destructive behaviors. So here we have Eros and Thanatos being warped together that creates the impetus of their motivations. There's been historically many serial killers who engage in behaviors that has a strong sexual release, and that's why they commit these horrendous acts. And so again, this is why these theories still exist. It helps us to possibly make sense of extreme behaviors. So to summarize all this, healthy balance is going to be key. We want a healthy striving for eros because that's going to give us a sense of consistency. We also want a consistent personality. And also, we want Thanatos to be motivated for change and completion. There's going to be time we have to change our personality in order to adapt in the circumstances and situations. It's probably a good thing we're not the same people we were as children, as well as in high school, and we probably won't be the same people 10 years from now. That's healthy, possibly. So we want a healthy balance between these two drives. Okay, so with this, to go deeper into defense mechanisms, this is probably the strongest component of these theories. There's been a lot written of defense mechanisms, so you're also going to hear of coping skills. So essentially, many of what we engage in behaviors to somehow protect ourselves or to kind of deal with the stress and anxiety of life. So this is how we cope. So we need some sort of coping skills to keep our sense of self. The strive is for a healthy balance. Again, I've said that multiple times. That's the key takeaway. We want a healthy balance of our behaviors and our personality traits. Too rigid defenses is going to lead to a limited ability to respond to a challenge. And a limited use of defenses is going to lead to a possible breakdown of who we are. So this again connects back to the ego slide we talked about earlier. In addition, defenses are going to be developed over time, and that's going to be the classification of immature versus mature defenses. So immature and mature defenses are broken down into where is the focus of the energy coming from. So an immature, it's strongly focused on the person. So it's strongly ego focused and rejection of the superego. So in other words, we gauge in behaviors that takes care of us first rather than looking at the environment or others to help us cope with the situation. So an immature defense is designed to address stress and uncomfortable feelings by blaming or causing damage to the external world. So blaming others for what happened to us, whether it's projection or other forms of defenses, can be one way to manage that anxiety, putting the responsibility on someone else, even though the responsibility lies with us. Or we can cause physical damage to the external world. So let's say I'm feeling a lot of anger right now. I don't know what to do with it, and I start throwing things across the room. That could be defined as an immature defense mechanism. So, behavior that is too rigid can damage and destroy relationships. I'm sure you've experienced this yourself with other individuals, and you at times may have noticed that you have engaged in immature behaviors that have impacted others. I've done it too. It's part of growing up and developing. So that's why we want immatures to behaviors to develop, but understand that they play a pretty strong role in helping us navigate and deal with anxiety and stress. So examples of immature behavior can be acting out, passive aggression, and projection. So projection is when my own stuff, I don't want to handle my own stuff, whether it's my own securities, my own fears, my own limitations. I'm just going to project that onto someone else and basically take my traits and characteristics and say it belongs to someone else. That way I don't have to have ownership for them. So mature defenses, those take away the stress and anxiety and try to convert the energy into ways that promote social connection. So that's the big distinction. An immature defense is really just going to focus on the immediate release of it and it's really focused on the person. Or mature defense is we're going to take this energy and convert it into a way that's socially constructive and connects us with others. So this person is not egocentric and accepts the idea that others can be a source of assistance. So others can help me. And this is going to fall in line with social interest that we'll talk about with individual psychology. So in a mature defense is some examples are altruism. So let's say I'm not feeling well, I can help others. That not only makes me feel better, but can also improve the quality of living for others. Humor. Most humor can be used when it's in a healthy, mature manner, and sublimation. So let's say, again, I'm feeling really angry right now, And rather than destroying my office, I could take that anger and write music or write, rip up some silly putty, whatever it is. I'm taking that energy and I may put it in a new environment. Um, so the distinction between immature and mature is taking that energy and converting it into something new. Immature is essentially just finding a way to push the energy away, push the anxiety away, and can sometimes have negative impacts on relationships. Okay. So, again, to reiterate, the past is key in developing personality. And this is a big criticism of psychoanalysis because historically, these theories kind of created the impetus to blame parents for their child's behavior. There's more to this. And as these theories developed, there's also the responsibility piece, as we just talked about with the defense mechanisms. It can be easy to blame others for our limitations. And again, that's going to be seen as an immature defense. A more a more mature defense would be finding a way to take that energy, that blame, and creating a more constructive component. How can we grow from that? How can we promote growth and stagnation? Excuse me, promote growth rather than stagnating. Because blaming of the past or using the past as a final explanation can create stagnation. So, yes, there's criticism to these theories, and as these theories are modernly practiced, there's more an emphasis on okay, yeah, the past play a role in developing this personality, but what can that person do to modify or change that personality if they so choose? But it's understanding that depending on our relationship with caregivers during our development will influence how we relate to other self and others as we grow. And attachment theory has a strong connection to psychoanalysis. So, attachment styles is very popular at this moment, and there's been a resurgence of attachment based therapies and attachment research. So, I want to talk about the different styles and understand that depending on the specific attachment model, there's going to be different uses of these terms. So, essentially, we have four classifications of attachment styles. So, attachment styles have a combination of temperament, which we talked about in Module 3. So, genetic and biological components influence attachment, as well as relationships in the child's experience. In addition to that, the thing to remember with attachment styles, just because we have a certain attachment style growing up, does not mean it's finite. Attachment styles can always change, always grow and develop. That's just how counseling and therapy works, is promoting different attachment styles. And also, we can have different attachment styles be expressed depending on the environment. Classic situationist perspective. So here's the four types of styles. Understand there's a way more nuance and complexity when we apply this to the real world. But essentially, the four types are secure. So this is a positive view of self and others. So a secure individual will have thoughts of, I'm comfortable depending on others, and I'm comfortable on others depending on me. So this is a mature kind of defense element in this person. I can take care of myself, and I also know others can take care of me when needed. So they feel secure because no matter what happens to them, they're going to have options on who they can rely on. They can rely on themselves, they can rely on others, and there's a positive view of this. From an Adlerian view, this is like essential social interest. Okay, we'll talk more about that later. Another component of attachment is anxious preoccupied. They're going to have a negative view of self and a positive view of others. This is very similar to an inferiority complex, which we'll talk more when we get to Adler. So, an anxious preoccupied, I am comfortable depending on others, but I'm not comfortable depending on myself or others depending on them. So that's anxious preoccupied. Dismissive avoidance is going to be a positive view of self and a negative view of others. So this is a superiority complex. Others are undependable, and the only person I can depend on is myself. And the final one is fearful avoidant, confused view of self or others. I know I should trust others and trust myself, but I can't trust others nor trust myself. So it's interesting when we look at friendships and romantic partnerships on various levels, we can see attachment styles come into play. Typically, secure individuals hang out with secure people. Uh, and then what we see though is there's a pairing between the anxious, preoccupied, and dismissive avoidant. And what can happen sometimes is they tend to bond together. So what happens is a relationship can start to struggle when the needs of both these individuals are not being met. Um, so the anxious preoccupied is going to bond with a dismissive avoidant, and there's going to be at times where a dismissive avoidant no longer feels comfortable being connected to this person because they feel the person is undependable and they can only depend on themselves. So they can they feel like they can only trust themselves. So that can create a rupture in the relationship. And the anxious, preoccupied person is going to be so focused on the needs of the other person that what starts to happen is dismissive avoidant starts to withdraw from the relationship, and the anxious, preoccupied is going to start to pursue. So, withdraw, pursue. And this is going to create more withdrawal, and this creates more pursuit. So, and that's a common pattern we see in relationships, friendships, partnerships, romantic involvement is that withdraw, pursue pattern. So what's happening is the withdraw is for the avoidant to be more independent because they don't want to be dependent or rely on the other person. You may hear them say like, hey, I just want to take care of myself. It's scary that I have to feel like I have to take care of you because I don't know if I can. The anxious preoccupied feels like they can't take care of themselves. They need someone else. I need you in my life. You're so important to me. I don't know how I could live without you, right? And so that's going to create this game, this pattern, this withdrawal. So ideally, in those circumstances, a possibility for growth and change is to foster secure attachment for both individuals. This idea that they can comfortably depend on others and have a comfortability on others depending on them. Fearful avoidance, again, a lot of that's going to be the same capacity as learning to find the ability to trust others and trust themselves. And so there's always, even though we can label um, these attachment styles, there's always the possibility for growth and development. Okay, so with that, another famous typology is Karen Horney's the moving towards, right? And so this again relates to relationships. Um, when we're working with people in our lives or have friends, family, colleagues, etc., we may see these different types of behaviors. So moving towards is someone who shows a lot of compliance. They're fantastic to work with. They make you feel so good about them yourself because they need to be liked, and they're expressed through pleasing others. And moving towards it tends to put others before themselves. And again, this type of idea is going to come up again in Adlerian. Moving away is going to be defined as someone who's liked, need to be liked is viewed as almost impossible for the individual is fearful that they are flawed. And because of that fear, the individual tends to avoid any situations where the fear can be proven right. So again, this is going to be the avoidant. If we go back to this slide here, this will be the dismissive avoidant, is the moving away. When times get stressful, that's going to increase their fear that they are possibly flawed. And therefore, to get rid of that fear, they're going to move away from the situation. They're going to withdraw. And then the third component is moving against. So that's the aggression. This individual need for to be liked is striving for power, prestige, dominance, and independence. So they put self before others. So this is going to be the superiority complex we'll cover with Adler. So essentially, these three ways of being is depending on our own stress and insecurities, it's going to be how we interact with others. If we're not sure of our own security, um, and have a low sense of self, possibly we're going to be compliant, is we're going to be motivated to please others because maybe we're fearful of rejection. And by pleasing others, that helps mitigate our fear. And so we're going to tend to put others before ourselves, again, to manage that possible underneath rejection. Moving away, if we're fearful that we're flawed, um, and that others may see that being flawed, we're not going to provide the opportunity for them to really get to know us. And again, this can also be a fear of rejection. And therefore, we're going to find a way to overshadow it. And it may be withdrawal, and that maybe work for some people. In addition to underneath, we could also have the rejection that's motivating someone to be aggressive. Um, by power, prestige, dominance, and independence can make someone overcome those inferiority, insecurities, and that's going to help them cope with the world. So, underneath all of this, we could all have similar feelings, but we're all managing differently depending on our past histories, what we learned, and the environment we're in. So, finally, in coming to a close with all this, the final piece to keep in mind with psychoanalysis is the role that fantasies may play in personality change. So, from this model, everything is purposeful, so fantasies exist for a reason. There's some sort of fulfillment we get and some sort of pleasure for striving for them. Fantasies and imagination are an important part of being human. This is really the idea of creativity and understanding, role plays and the games we play and play in general, and thoughts and creation and movies and books are so key to these elements because use of fantasies and imaginations are what makes a huge element of being human. So the thing to remember is we're in society that promotes more stagnation of fantasy than creation, right? So again, what can happen too is we don't want to feel stagnated. And unfortunately, our society promotes more of a voyeuristic view of fantasy fulfillment. That's what entertainment is. So you can sit, all day binging shows and you're consuming them rather than having your own fantasies come from within. Does that make sense? So you internalize others' fantasies rather than your own fantasies coming into play. And what we call that is active imagination. When you sit there, allow your own fantasy worlds and thoughts and feelings come up, that's active rather than passive. So that's important too, that what can happen quite a bit is we can feel a sense of loss of who we are, a lack of meaning, a lack of purpose, because most of our fantasies don't come from us, they come from others. And this can create body image issues, they can create depression, anxiety, mental health. There's been a plethora of research on this, and just recently, Facebook had their own internal research talking about how Instagram can play a significant role in impacting mental health in young adults and teenagers. So, with that, though, we want to give space for our own fantasies and at the same time understand that some fantasies may be encouraged to become reality, while other fantasies may be more beneficial to the individual to be kept in a symbolic frame. So, that's also what makes these theories unique from other therapy modalities is you don't always have to explain your internal world to others. In some theories and modalities, honesty and complete expression is important. But from these frameworks, some things are better kept in for who you are, into yourself. And with that, too, there's a more spectral perspective of from these models, from the readings and videos and other slides we'll get into, humans are not the most positive beings. We can have thoughts of bad things, and sometimes it's better to keep those things from not becoming reality. So again, everything's a balance. We want the balance of being able to express certain fantasies and thoughts and feelings, and others are going to be more kept in the symbolic world rather than being used and made into reality. So hopefully that makes sense. To give a quick synopsis of all this, again, everything's striving for balance. Much of our behavior is outside of our awareness, and there's a lot of conflicting parts inside of us. If we aren't aware of those conflicting parts, that may lead us to behaviors that are destructive, not only to ourselves, but other people in our lives. And therefore, it is our responsibility to become aware of those behaviors in order to promote growth and change. So, thank you with that. I'm going to stop sharing. Again, you may feel overwhelmed with all this information. That's totally okay. What I really recommend is watching some of the videos, especially the one is Psychoanalysis Weird, and I think that gives a good picture of what these models are. With that being said, I hope you enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you. Have a good one.